Brian Mealer. Be hearing from me off and on throughout the day. I'm a professor at the University of Wyoming and director of an institute that focuses on managing annual grasses across the western U.S. with primary focus on different strategies. Very excited about today's event. What we're going to hear about today is really the culmination of, in some ways, 6 months of dedicated planning and effort, and in other ways, I'm going to say decades of research and experience and knowledge and learning about this important issue. Hopefully that everything seems to be working on your end. If you do seem to be having any technical issues, a couple quick things to try. Maybe consider logging off and then rejoining the event to make sure that the connection is working. Few sort of very basic things like make sure that your volume is turned up, and I would say make sure that your correct speakers are activated on whichever device that you're using. And if you continue to have issues, Claire Visconti is providing some technical help with today's event, and this is her webinar here, or her email here. We may be able to post that in the chat as well, or send that out so that folks can have access to that. Thank you for joining us. One other quick logistical note is that we're going to have questions and answers, and you should have access to the question and answer submission box within your Zoom link. If you will please submit your questions into that, we will do our best to try to address as many questions as we can. I also want to talk through the many of you that submitted questions prior to the event. We had well over 150 questions that were submitted that we're going to try to weave into the discussion today and try to address as many of those as we can, but don't let that stop you from submitting questions in real time as part of today's events. We will be capturing those questions that get submitted today, and especially those that we're not able to address. And in subsequent products and materials, we're going to try to take a run and provide some additional information around those frequently asked questions that we may be receiving there. Going to see this several times throughout the day. We've kind of got this roadmap laid out that we will reference in terms of where we are throughout today's event. It gives important notifications such as things like grabbing more coffee and getting lunch and an opportunity to take a bathroom break. And you also should have access to the agenda that you can keep an eye on important topics that may be high on your radar that you want to make sure not to miss. Talk a little bit about programmatic stuff here and why it is that our group has come together and give you an introduction to what we're calling the Invasive Annual Grasses Tech Transfer Partnership. You're on the webinar, so I think you realize that invasive annual grasses in western rangelands, and in particular the sagebrush biome, are an important and I would say potentially increasing issue. And our group recognized that in some cases there's somewhat of a disconnect between high-level planning and actions that may be being taken on the ground to directly manage invasive annual grasses. And so our goal as a partnership is really to equip land managers with information and support, and I'm going to come back to that idea of support several times throughout the day today, to strategically implement annual grass management with hopes of increasing our ability to do better at managing the rangelands that we all depend on in one way or another. Our partnership is funded through a diverse group of supporting partners, including all of the logos that you see here. And then some of our staff support comes from some private Foundation funding in addition to some additional federal funding. And can't thank the folks enough for this support that has really allowed us to bring a group of folks together and try to tackle this issue in a meaningful way and to provide support to folks around the West. So I mentioned our team a little bit. We have what we consider a core team that meets regularly and is working on developing events like we're having today and other outreach materials. Myself, Claire Visconti, who I mentioned earlier, is part of our team in Wyoming. Seth Flanagan is our primary core team member with the BLM. Many of you folks are going to be familiar with these faces, and if not the faces, with the names. Lindy Garner with Fish and Wildlife Service. Jeremy Maestas is going to be speaking some today. He's with Working Lands for Wildlife with the NRCS. Jane Mangold is at Montana State University. She is providing a lot of support. Will not be speaking today, but part of the technical team that has been developing materials and working through some of the issues and the content that we're going to discuss. Paul Myman, we'll hear more from Paul and in several different segments today. He's with University of Nevada at Reno in the northern part of the state. Andrew Olson is with IWJV. We'll be hearing from him shortly as well. And Jordan Spock is with the National Park Service and is providing an important perspective to our team from that organization. And I will say a broader sort of national perspective as well. I'd also like to point out that it's not just the smiling faces that you've seen on the slides that are part of our partnership and our core team. We regularly tap into a larger group of managing partners and subject matter experts around the West, some of whom we will hear from today, to really bring that expertise together in a way that we can try to get clear, concise messaging that's going to be helpful to folks moving forward. And one of the products that has developed up to this point is, rather than trying to come up with a list of prescriptions, knowing that things are very situationally specific and have different sideboards and challenges, we have developed a list of principles, and we should be able to see a link to a more developed document that explains these principles in the chat. You should be able to click on that and download the principles for strategic management of annual grasses with an eye toward proactive management that really stems from this concept of defending and growing high quality habitat core areas. From left to right, we're going to keep coming back to these today. Act proactively, which in a nutshell is not wait until the situation is so far gone that we move into an area with low probability of success. Understanding biology and ecology of the system helps us to make decisions with an understanding of how that system may react and seek leverage points where we can do a little bit of effort and see a lot of good. Consider landscape context, understanding that landscapes are tied together and that this is a landscape scale problem, that we can't work on a single individual parcel necessarily and seek to not be influenced by adjoining pieces of land. And because of that landscape scale of the problem, working together is almost a necessity. And that ties in the thoughts of different land ownerships, but also knowing that invasive grasses, as other invasive species, don't respect boundaries or borders. They will continue to move and continue to potentially be a problem. And then also recognizing that this is not a one and done effort. This is something that we're going to need to be committed to over the long term. And we're going to revisit each of these principles in more depth as we go throughout the day. Our approach for these workshops is we're at the bottom of this pyramid today. This is what we're calling our level 1. I will go ahead and say that if you expected to come here to get the answer, you might as well just log off now and save the rest of the time, because there is no single answer for this complex issue. But I think that as the story develops throughout the day, you will see things coalesce in such a way that I feel that we're in a place where we are farther along, and I think that we know more. We have different tools that will allow us to do better and succeed more. We will follow up. We're going to have some more information on what we're calling our level twos, which is a combination of in-field and classroom workshops that we're going to try to do in a distributed fashion throughout the Western U.S. in the coming years. And we will ask at some point if folks are interested in working with us to host or engage in those level twos. And then we've started some level threes this past fall, where we will actually commit to bringing a team to sit down with local working groups and facilitate a dialogue on developing strategy within those partnerships. So that's a little bit about us and our program. Wanted to talk about you and who the participants are. It's like I've lost one label there, but a very diverse group of registration folks here. We've got gray is actually other, which would include things such as local government organizations, landowners, tribal entities, anything that doesn't necessarily fall within some of these other categories. A significant portion of federal partners that have registered for today, and I would say a very strong geographic representation across much of the area that is potentially impacted by invasive annual grasses. One of the things that really struck me about the registrations and the diversity is how that recognizes the importance of this issue. And I would say the sense of urgency and the need for information that we all want and that we all need. And I hope that the variety of needs are reflected in the materials that we go through today. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Erica Fitzpatrick, who's really going to be our MC and kind of our guide through the day today. Erica lives in Eastern Oregon with her family, where they have been involved in a ranching operation for numerous generations. She also is the owner of Mesa Communications that you see here. She's been actively involved in a number of efforts focused around not just invasive annual grasses, but rangeland issues in general. We've had the pleasure of working with her in the past on some projects related to the Society for Range Management and others. And so I'm going to hand it over to Erica, and she's going to be the face that takes us through the rest of the day and make sure that we all continue to know where we are going. And she's going to pose some tough but important questions to the panelists and the speakers today. So Erica, thanks for being part of the team today.
Thank you, Brian. I've been looking forward today for quite some time, and I'm excited to walk with you all throughout the day. I know it's going to be a long and packed day, but it's structured in a way that is going to be engaging, and it has an incredible amount of information. As Brian said, yeah, we ranch here in Eastern Oregon, and with that, invasive annual grasses are just are really pervasive, especially Medusa head in our area. So we know kind of how aggressive and damaging it can be as an invader. And I've really probably paid attention and known about the problem for the past 7 or 8 years. And even in that short amount of time, we've really seen it spread like leprosy into a lot of the areas that we love and that we depend on. And so it's felt like a rather discouraging and paralyzing problem for quite some time. But recently, we've been so encouraged by the momentum and the movement, much in part to many of the people here on this call and many of the efforts that are popping up, likely due to the folks that are here joining us today, many of you on this call. So it's actually a very exciting time, and that's why I've really been looking forward to today. So with that, as Brian mentioned, we have this roadmap, and each section is structured differently. So we have panels, we have presentations and Q&As. So again, please drop questions as you have them into that question function. We have a lot to cover today. So with that, we're really hoping that by the end of it, you get a couple of key things out of it. One, that it's not too late to tackle this problem, but time is of the essence. And that you will consider some of the strategies that are presented here today to do that, and that you're familiar with the basic tools available to do so.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Jeremy Maestas here with the NRCS. And wow, I have been looking forward to this day for a long time. I've spent my career working on rangelands in the West and sagebrush ecosystems in particular, and we've never really had a great answer for this invasive annual grass problem. But I want to tell you that I feel more hopeful today than I've ever felt due to a culmination of a number of breakthroughs. And we're going to talk about that kind of right now in this session. We're, introducing a couple of new panelists here. Brian Mueller will be back speaking with us, and also Dr. Chad Boyd, who's the research leader for the Agricultural Research Service out of Burns, Oregon, Eastern Oregon Ag Research Station. Two very well-respected thought leaders in this space, but who've operated in different geographies, right? From Brian in the Rockies to Chad in the Great Basin. And so this is an opportunity for both of them to come together and kind of share their perspectives as to why they think now is the time to take this on. But before we dive into some of their opening remarks and our fireside chat with them, I just wanted to get you thinking about why it's so important to address kind of the why behind the what and where and how before we get into all of the details. And just think back, if any of you have raised toddlers or currently have toddlers, what's one of the first things they say the minute they start talking? Why? Just a crazy amount of intellectual curiosity, right? Well, guess what? Human beings don't really change. Maybe they hide it better as they get older, but everyone we talk to is going to sit there with their arms folded, wondering why they should care about this issue as you're trying to sell them all the reasons why, products and things we should be doing and treatments and whatnot. And so let's take a moment to reflect on that before we get into the mechanics, because I think it will help you as you work with land managers, landowners, and communities to try to build the cultural change that's going to be needed to make this happen. And, if you weren't aware, we have over 1,000 people registered for this event, okay? Brian showed you the geographies. There is just a lot of demand and interest in this topic. And so we're hoping to inspire enough of you to go home and start these conversations in your communities. And so with that, I'd like to invite Chad to come on, and let's go to the next slide, please, Brian. And we'll get opening remarks from Chad and Brian, and then go to our fireside chat.
Great. Really excited to be here today. Jeremy asked me to kind of kick us off this morning. And, when I think about the annual grass situation, if we're going to get a beat on where we're at, I think that we also need to have an appreciation for where we've been. And a part of that is that we've got a growing number of folks who have not been directly exposed to the history of defending and growing the core. So I wanted to hit on some key points. The period from 2000 to 2015 that culminated in a not warranted ESA decision for sage grouse was one of a growing collective acceptance that we didn't have a grouse problem, we had an ecosystem problem. One of the symptoms of which is that grouse weren't doing as well as they could be. And that was a really watershed moment because we graduated from the idea of thinking about species to thinking about ecosystem. That was really important. And it was really brought on again by the urgency of the 2015 listing decision. After that, along comes this notion of defend and grow the core from the Working Lands for Wildlife folks. And this was an elegant rally point that we could begin to organize sagebrush conservation around. The only problem was that we didn't really have the spatial data at that point to go along with it. Well, that changed in pretty short order with geospatial advancements like the rangeland analysis platform that really populated that notion of defend and grow the core with data such that it could be used for management planning at really large spatial scales. Then along comes the sagebrush conservation design, and that was in 2022 recently. And the SCD quantified the rate of loss of sagebrush core habitats, found that most of that loss was associated with ecosystem problems, and it provided a spatial framework for us to think strategically about sagebrush habitat conservation at a biome scale. So next slide, Brian. So these factors cumulatively make strategic conservation of annual grass rangelands possible. So what's different now? I'll say it again, strategic conservation through the lens of defend and grow the core is what's different now. At the biome scale, we could not have implemented this approach even 5 years ago because of a lack of geospatial tools. That alone would have precluded us from doing so. And we're going to need that strategic mindset to attack one of the biggest, actually the biggest problem that we have in the biome, and that is invasive annual grasses. Next slide, Brian. And so if we look at rate of habitat loss, this first stat comes from the sagebrush conservation design. We're losing about 1.3 million acres per year of core and growth opportunity habitat throughout the biome, and that's averaged over the last 20 years. If we just look at annual grass, or excuse me, core habitat, and this is coming from Tina Mazalewski's paper that's in review right now. Just looking at core, 69% of the loss of core habitat in the last 20 years was associated with why we're here today, invasive annual grasses. So that combined with the rate of loss suggests that if we're going to do something about the annual grass threat, we've got to see it as an urgent problem and a problem that is literally of generational importance. And it's one that's not going to be solved by a piecemeal or opportunistically driven approach. Okay, Brian, next slide. But we're in the early stages, and we need to be cognizant of that because there's some potential stumbling blocks when we think about strategically defending and growing core habitat on rangelands that are under threat from invasive annual grasses. And I want to talk about some of those stumbling blocks really quickly here. First, I think we have to recognize, it's imperative that we recognize that historic opportunity, largely opportunity-driven conservation matters. And I think that for two reasons. The first is if we don't pay respect and homage to the efforts of the past, we're going to lose about half of our audience right off the bat. And secondly, imagine a world where we had done nothing to deal with, let's say, fire and invasive annuals. We'd done nothing. Where would we be at now? I think that the avoided loss associated with historic conservation, whether it was opportunistically driven or not, is real, and it's probably incalculable. So those efforts have been really important, but we're losing 1.3 million acres a year of good and pretty good sagebrush habitat. That's not sustainable. Something has to change. I think that something is strategically defending and growing core habitat that's being threatened by annual grasses. The second potential stumbling block is we need to be cognizant of the enormity of the paradigm shift that we have here. Strategic conservation is a new concept. We are largely opportunity and reactionary based conservation. That's our history. And again, I'm not throwing rocks at that. That's just where we've been. But this is a big paradigm shift for people, and we need to be cognizant of that. And we need to realize that change is going to take some time. Third potential stumbling block, we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. If we can manage at spatial scales that we couldn't imagine, 5-10 years ago, with the tools that we have today, we can think and plan and act at heretofore untold spatial scales. If you're not uncomfortable with managing at the million-acre scale, then you're probably not a very fun person to be around. You should be uncomfortable. It's an intimidating thing, but recognize that for what it is. That uncomfortableness is a sign of what's good about you as a person and as a manager. It means that you care about being successful. You care about the resource. It also means that you're not afraid to do difficult things. You show up at the table and do them. So that uncomfortableness is really the outward manifestation of things that are good about you as a person and a manager. And lastly, we need to realize that strategic conservation in service of defending and growing the core is not about a map. It's about a mindset. Strategic conservation is about reclaiming an otherwise opportunistically driven decision space in a way that allows us to think, in all capital letters, think adaptively over time about complex problems. Okay, that's the mindset. Next slide. And I'll also say that if we see strategic conservation as a map, maps are about freezing space and time, and it's about institutionalizing where we're at now. And when we institutionalize things, that's kind of code for quitting thinking, right? So we can't institutionalize this. We have to have the proper mindset. And one mindset that I will offer up is the idea of maintain, improve, and contain. What we recently finished up a paper, it's in review in Rangeland Ecology and Management right now. And what is this mindset? In the paper, we say that we need to maintain those areas where we have the most to lose. In other words, we're going to defend core where we have areas that are likely to transition to annuals if they're disturbed, and probably low R&R. If we lose low resistance and resilience, those areas that if we lose them to annuals, we're going to have a devil of a time getting them back. Secondly, we're going to improve those areas where success is most likely. We're not going to put our restoration and rehabilitation resources into areas that are incredibly low resistance and resilience where we're not likely to have success. No, we're going to grow those cores in more productive areas where we have a higher resistance to annual grasses and a higher likelihood of success. And lastly, contain infestations that cannot easily be remediated. These are going to be areas of large infestation that are probably going to be in low resistance and resilience plant communities where we're just simply going to contain the problem. So next slide. So now we have a conceptual paradigm for strategically and adaptively thinking through the geography of management effort. And importantly, that maintain, improve, contain mentality, that mindset is data source agnostic. In other words, we can populate it with whatever data are available and appropriate, and it has utility at any scale. In the publication that's in review right now, we mapped, maintain, improve, and contain areas across the sagebrush biome. I'll also tell you that I use it on my house at the property that my house is located on, which is 25 acres in size. You can use it at any scale. So that's why I think now is different. We have the collective realization that we're facing ecosystem problems, and we now have both the tools and the paradigms that allow us to think and act at scales that matter in combating invasive annual grasses. So thank you.
Sorry, guys, I had an issue with some of my technology. Hopefully, we're working now. Chad, I cannot agree more with many of the sentiments that you made. I'm going to try to briefly go through this and remind us all that invasion is a process. It's a process that occurs across the landscape, and this continued, somewhat predictable progression from introduction, establishment, invasion, and impact toward sites that are degraded and potentially dominated by annual grasses is a repeated process that we see. And we can think about, I'm sure that we all have examples in our mind where historically we would have thought that there are places that are not susceptible to invasion or impact by invasive annual grasses. And that seems that as whenever we draw a hard line, it seems like if we wait long enough that hard line shifts. And there's some recent research evidence that suggests that the pace of this invasion is actually increasing to where we're seeing more invasion happen more quickly across the landscape into new areas. and that conversion is happening not necessarily due to fire, but it is related to fire. And so I think about how these different states of invasive grass impacts occur across a landscape, and what that might do for a particular site, and how those different sites relate to one another. And if we start to break that down a little bit, how can we be more proactive and try to identify opportunities for success? So I kind of start thinking about it in terms of this. If we're an intact core, diverse rangeland plant community that is functioning and providing the ecosystem goods and services that we want as kind of our goal. We have high ecosystem services, I will say potentially high in this transition zone. And then when we get into the most impacted, most degraded sites, we start to lose the benefits from those natural systems. Probability of success, if we're thinking about that definition of what we're managing toward that I just presented just now, a diverse, fully functioning rangeland community, as we move toward that degraded state, our probability of successfully managing and obtaining those goals is much lower than it is at the intact core stage. The cost to try to manage toward that goal is much higher in the degraded state. I've got low to moderate in those other different states, just as sort of a relative gauge of cost in terms of time and money. One of the key things that we think about, and I think it's really reflected in the maintain, improve, contain philosophy, is this idea of recovery potential. If we don't have a lot of desirable perennial plants on these sites that have been degraded, then our level of activity and the inherent natural recovery potential that remains on those sites is relatively low. We're going to have to augment desirable plant communities with seeding, and this transition zone still has a lot of the raw materials for recovery. And if we can implement management strategies in those places in a proactive way to stop the continued degradation and recover what's still on that site, then our probability of success may be higher. I'll say in some ways recovery potential is irrelevant in core because we're not thinking about recovering things, we're thinking about maintaining the attributes of that site that are already there. So to come back, I will reiterate this idea of maintain the intact core. Areas of potential high improvement is things that we might think about in those transition zones in this moderate sort of invasion state. And then here we're really faced with a different set of options. Contain it to keep it from moving into new areas. Invest, as Chad said, in potentially expensive restoration projects, or accept the hand that we are currently dealt. And honestly, try to figure out a way to manage it as a new system that we can recover some of those benefits from. Ironically, our toolbox is probably really bigger when we get down into that highly degraded state, but our likelihood of success is probably lower. And so our number of tools and our approach as we move from an intact core to a highly degraded state change. And we're going to dig into this concept a little bit later during today's event and really start to drill down into what some of those on-the-ground management practices are. Wanted to show this picture as a reminder of a few things. One is that we're talking about scale, big scale. Chad mentioned being uncomfortable thinking at the millions of acres of scale. Much of our previous work has been done at the individual site scale, such as the picture in the foreground here. But we're thinking about managing from what's in the foreground all the way back to the Bighorn Mountains there in the background, and thinking at large scale because they're large scale processes and challenges that we're dealing with. The other thing I would point out is that 2 years prior to this picture being taken, that site had 40 to 50% ventinata cover, and this is 2 years following an herbicide application that was applied aerially to this site. Inherent recovery potential gives us the opportunity to see the native plant communities respond, and it's not just happening at a site-specific scale, we're having some success, and we're going to hear from some folks that are seeing success at large scale, such as the treatment line that we see on the left of this picture that is pretty much absent of invasive annual grasses, and you can see a healthy sagebrush ecosystem that we've released from annual grass competition in that site. We're going to talk about that a little bit more today. I wanted to come back to Chad's great comment about mindset and talk about a little bit more on our tech transfer partnership and how it ties this together. Defend and Grow the Core is not an approach, it's not a guidebook. It really is a philosophy or a mindset that thinks about ways to improve our ability to stop further degradation in high quality habitat. It's supported by things such as the sagebrush conservation design that gives us a spatially explicit assessment of both challenges and opportunities throughout the sagebrush biome. And really what our goal is to figure out how to unite those things to do good work on the ground with the combination of spatial prioritization and assessment and turning that into fitting the right management actions in the right place. And lastly, I would just say, I think one thing that makes where we are currently different, maybe than where we were 10 to 15 years ago, is the level of awareness and engagement at high levels of organizations that manage and influence the management of lands throughout the Western U.S. I think it's probably the highest awareness and urgency and support that we've probably seen in my career. And I think that sets us up in such a way that we can make some positive traction. So,
excellent. Thanks so much to Chad and Brian for those thoughtful remarks. I want to invite Brian, Chad, and our MC, Erica, to turn their cameras on. And with the remaining time here in this session, we'll just do a little fireside chat, I'll call it, because all of us are friends. We've had a lot of conversations over beverages in the evening about these types of ideas. And so I want to explore a little bit further for our participants some of the things that piqued my interest in your comments. And the first thing I'll start with is, Chad mentioned the sagebrush conservation design, which we won't go into this workshop too much, but what did that teach us, Chad? What were the insights from that made you think we actually still have opportunities to be proactive, to maintain intact sagebrush areas that aren't yet overrun with invasive annuals? I mean, I live here in the Great Basin, you do as well. I think it's a pervasive mindset that cheatgrass is everywhere, right? And are we just talking about Wyoming as the only place where we still have opportunities to do this?
No, not at all. And what gives me hope is that this isn't something that we've tried at scale. And again, as I've made reference to, we haven't been able to think and plan at really large spatial scales longer than about maybe 5 years ago. And really in the last 3 that's come on board. So that's what gives me hope, Jeremy. This is the thing that we haven't tried that makes the most sense, because dealing with cheatgrass, it really is like a battle plan. It's almost a militaristic concept. And if we're going to go into a battle and our philosophy is, well, let's do a flanking maneuver without knowing anything about the battlefield, that's probably not going to be the best tactic, the best strategy. We need to be able to see the battlefield for what it is and react accordingly. And I think that strategically defending and growing core with the spatial tools that we have available now allows us to do that. That's new, and I'm excited about it.
Great. Thanks. Brian, anything to add to that?
No, I think Chad covered it. I think just the well, I say no, and then you know that I can't help myself. I just think the dramatic influence that seems to be tied directly to the impacts of annual grasses was something that really stood out to me from the sagebrush conservation design.
Yeah, it's never been so clear that is the number one reason we're losing our sagebrush systems. So thank you for the remarks on that. I kind of want to jump to this next question. Near and dear to my heart, working with private landowners around the biome. It's a working landscape. Half the biome is privately owned. The other half is public, that's largely leased for public lands, livestock grazing. And so let's talk a little bit about economics, kind of cutting to the chase. If we're gonna be working with producers as partners in this endeavor, share some words of wisdom with us about, why might ranchers want to proactively manage annuals? And I'd actually like to point this first question to Erica, but I want to get all of your perspectives to weigh in from your geographies. But Erica, as a ranch family who's doing this, what's the relevance and importance to you?
Yeah, I'd like to say that it's a no-brainer and that it's just, it should be an easy decision to make. But when you tie the economics in there, I think that's can be the biggest holdup. And it goes back to what Brian was saying a little bit about awareness of the problem and the urgency behind it, that varies for a lot of folks. And I think that depends largely on the species they're dealing with. Unfortunately, cheatgrass has become pretty pervasive for everyone to have to manage and learn how to deal with, because it can be used as a forage. That just kind of works into folks' plan, or it's had to. But when it comes to Ventonata and Medusa head, the equation gets a lot simpler because it's such a poor forage, or it's not a forage base at all. And so I think from a ranching perspective, you're looking at an annual budget. And a lot of times to do any kind of treatment, there's that really large upfront cost of both time and money, and that investment early on that's going to have the long-term payout, but sometimes that just doesn't look great on an annual budget. And so I think those are a few things to keep in mind that, from the ranching community, people are always having to kind of balance that and look forward. But we've seen the damage that a Medusa head in particular can do, and we know that we need to take action. It's just needing to have it come at the right time. And I think what's exciting is these strategies and paradigm shifts that allow us to break it down into manageable pieces and manageable steps.
Excellent. Thank you for that perspective. Brian, I know you've had some experience working with producers on the ground, and what's been your observation? Have you got any data or insights on the return for the investment?
Yeah, and I will thank Erica for her comments. I think it aligns very well with hers. And it's not just our data from across the West, is that the tendency and the trend is that with increasing invasive annual grass composition in our rangeland communities, that we see a decrease in forage quality and quantity, and in some cases it's pronounced, 50% or greater loss in true grazing capacity on some of those sites. And the sort of the counter question to that is, would you stand by and just let someone remove 50% of your grazing capacity without actively doing something about it? And I can't think of anybody that would want to do that. And so the research is pretty clear, especially when it comes to those less palatable invaders. But even for something like cheatgrass, with the slightly redeeming quality that it's good forage early in the year, the operational flexibility in terms of putting together a rotational grazing plan really starts to be restricted when you're dominated by a plant that has a very narrow window of palatability and then high flammability after that. And it's not just our livestock that are affected by those forage quality and quantity issues. It moves beyond just a rancher weed management issue, and it's beginning to have serious impacts for wildlife. And I think there's more and more research that is supporting that as well.
Great, thanks. And with the last 1 minute, I'm going to give Chad the last word here. Maybe speak to us about the consequence of wildfire and related to this economics and invasion process.
Yeah, well, fire likes annuals. One of the few things that does. And, the thing that we've seen in our modeling efforts in the Great Basin is the best predictor of large wildfires is the previous 2 years accumulation of fine fuels. And it's not that shrubs don't matter. Shrubs play a different role. They make fire hot. They make it dangerous. But if you look back in history, and we've done that going back to the late 1980s, the best predictor, David Pilliod's group found the same thing at USGS. The best predictor is fine fuels. And that has a lot to do with continuity, because if you subtract out all of the grasses from a sagebrush landscape, you're left with a pretty discontinuous fuel landscape, right? You put them back in, and now you got the connectivity that allows you to go from shrub to shrub and engage the shrubs. That's what annual grasses do. They provide continuity. They fill the interspaces between the perennial bunch grasses and provide the continuity that allows us to, that creates the conditions in which we can get large wildfires. And 69% of the loss of core is associated with annuals, but what I didn't have in that graph in my presentation was the co-culprit, which is fire. It's not just the invasion of annuals; it's the fires that they promote that kill perennial bunch grasses, take shrubs out of the picture, decrease wildlife habitat, and reduce forage dependability.
Excellent. Yeah, and we've just seen dramatic effects on livestock operations when you're displaced from, particularly your public lands for many years during that recovery process. So there's a cost, even though it might not be imminent. It's there, and it could hit you at any time from inaction. And so thank you so much to our thought leaders here. We'll hear back from the both of you at the end of the workshop. I'm going to turn it back over to our MC, Erica, to move us right along to the next section. Thank you.